An alien landed in his backyard and told a retired cardiologist something that would not let him sleep. The builders, the teachers, the myths called Anunnaki, were coming back in 2026, not as symbols, not as whispers in fragmented tablets, but as a physical return, a coordinated reactivation of temples and machines hidden beneath millennia of sand and secrecy. That phrase, "they will return," arrived in James Peterson's mind not as speech, but as a falling stone of knowing, a cold clarity that left him trembling at the kitchen table while Margaret washed the dishes, unaware. Dr. James Peterson was the kind of man who believed in the measurable. For 42 years he'd read rhythms in hearts the way a geologist reads rock strata, patterns, anomalies, repeatable facts. He'd retired at 69 with plaques on the wall, a house full of routine, a wife who knew when the thermostat needed adjusting, and a skepticism that had survived more than one miracle explained away by better tests. He kept his hands clean of superstition. He kept his life tidy. Then, 8 months before the backyard landing, something began to unclench within him that had nothing to do with cardiology. It started as the smallest of betrayals, a morning where he woke at 3:13 a.m. with the sound of running water threaded through his blood. He lay motionless, aware of a salt-sour tang like river fog in his mouth. He would make a cup of tea and sit on the back stoop and watch the neighbor's dog ghost past the fence, and every shadow of steam would look to him like a shoreline he had once known. Tears would come without a reason and leave like footprints on his cheek. He missed appointments because he woke knowing he had to buy a ticket, then found the credit card in his hand and a confirmation in the inbox before he could finish his coffee. Margaret noticed the change long before she heard the story. She was practical, patient, and frightened in the small way spouses are when something unnameable rearranges the person they love. "You're losing sleep," she told him. "You need to see someone. A doctor, James." He laughed at first. How could the one who had told others to calm their panic be the subject of it? And then grew impatient with his own laughter. He found himself sketching triangles on the margins of his appointment pads, not thinking about geometry, but about angles that hummed. Medical checks returned ordinary results. Blood pressure nominal, EKG without arrhythmia, lipids within reason for a man of his age and life choices. The tests were honest, the machines indifferent. That only made it worse. Rational explanations dwindled to nothing more than noise in the background of an urgency that sounded like ocean. 2 months in, he bought a one-way ticket to Cairo for reasons he could not quite articulate. He told Margaret he needed to see stones, as if stones could explain what had been whispering in his chest. She asked him if he'd lost his mind and called it a joke when he said the word school and cried and refused to explain more. He did not tell her about the dreams where someone with a face like light adjusted a small crystal at the apex of an impossible room, or the dream where his hands glowed and shaped sound into healing. He did not tell her that in the morning, while shaving, he sometimes heard a word without syllables, a pressure against the inside of his skull that felt like a map being unfolded. You could chalk it up to age, someone would say. You could chalk it up to grief. You could call him unmoored. But then the backyard happened, and the story could no longer sit inside private symptoms. On an early autumn afternoon, 3 days before he was supposed to leave for Cairo, while shadow moved along the hedges and a gust shook the backyard elms, a pale oval of light pressed itself onto his lawn. It was not the furious airplane glare of modern craft, nor the cinematic whir of a helicopter. It was soft, as if the night had been folded into a pocket lamp and set down. James thought first of meteorites, because that is how a trained mind attempts to normalize the impossible, explain it away by old categories. He opened the sliding door and stepped onto the grass in slippers every man of his profession has worn when he thinks he's still in control. The shape rose without a sound, like breath inhaled from another room, and the air itself seemed to rearrange, a taste of copper, a pressure like a tiny ocean pressing behind his eyes. There was no ramp, no hatch in the human sense. The thing that approached was taller than James and more vertical than he could have conceived of being alive. Its skin, if skin is the word for it, held light in layers, translucence like marble that swam with slow internal currents of color. Green the color of river glasses, then a copper warmth as if a buried instrument warmed under sun. He remembered later that his training provided him tools to observe without collapsing. He cataloged sizes in his mind, even as the world rearranged.
The being stood perhaps 8 feet tall. It had elongated limbs articulated with joint lines like a sculpture's seams. Its head, if one could call it that, was gently tapered with angles that suggested a crown of thought. It did not blink in any human rhythm. When it moved, the air hummed, a low chord like a string instrument tuned beneath the world. There was no sound to its approach. Instead, James felt meaning as pressure behind his teeth, images settling like stones into place. The first contact was not words. It was an impression, a cascade of images and tones transmitted into the deep chest cavity where memory sometimes hides. He did not hear the phrase Anunnaki in English. Rather, the name arrived as a pattern, an origin story knot tied around the notion of teaching, of harvesting, of building. The being did not speak to his ears, but to the mechanisms of knowing.
It conveyed a lineage that carried dates the way a tree carries rings. 36,000 years it transmitted, and James felt the span of the number like a cold river running along his spine. He told me, James would repeat later, fingers pressed to his sternum where the memory pulsed like a scar, that they came as teachers, that they were never gods in the way humans imagined, but architects of a curriculum, a long school for the uplift of consciousness. At no moment in any of these recollections does the narrator claim that the being's explanations are archaeological proof. These are the contents of a transmission he received. They are the content of what he insists he experienced. The alien, the emissary in luminous, translucent form, projected not only facts but sensory textures, the sound of chisel on crystal, the smell of heated gold, and a vibration like a small bell struck inside a skull. And then the line came that would not leave him. In 2026, the idea pressed, not as a threat, but as a scheduled order in a calendar of cosmic care. We will return to reanimate the machines. The temples will be reawakened. The selection will be frequency, not paperwork. Prepare for the threshold near. It was not an ultimatum as much as a timestamp burned into his awareness. He exited the yard and did not run. He sat on the lawn and let the lights settle out of him, like iron filings clustering after a magnet passes. Margaret, inside preparing tea, would later tell anyone who would listen that when he entered the kitchen, his face had the glaze of someone who had seen the future and felt neither victory nor defeat, only weight. He could have dismissed it as a hallucination, a neurological event. He had tests run the next morning. MRI normal, blood chemistries within expected ranges, no evidence of a tumor or a stroke. The doctors did what they could. James knew the limits of their tools and loved them all the sooner for it. These facts, however, closed the door on certain mundane explanations and opened another, more porous one. Whatever had happened had not been a break in his physiology, but an incision into a deeper memory bank. What followed the backyard encounter was a cascade that no meter could measure. Images that flooded in and out with the precise economy of a well-constructed dream. He saw shores that no map recorded. He saw a city not of dust but of geometry, vast pyramidal forms arranged like resonant strings across a plain, connected by lines of liquid gold that reflected a sun he did not know he remembered. The alien's transmissions translated those images into explanation the way a teacher renders a parable into a lesson. They came, the being conveyed, and James felt it as if being told a childhood truth, to teach resonance, to tune a species that had the capacity for great light and great shadow. In the vision, the Anunnaki presence was not uniform. The emissary made distinctions. Some among them were builders, task-focused and coldly precise, who set prisms and angles into stone. Others were keepers of sound and pattern, who trained humans to listen and to shape frequencies. They spoke in ideals rather than words, balance, harmonics, stewardship. The alien transmitted the idea that the people who tended the temples learned practices that married anatomy to resonance, that certain rooms, cavities, and shapes were not simply for burial, but for modulation, that stone, gold, and crystal were arranged to hold and conduct subtle currents of pattern. James experienced the Great Pyramid not as a tomb, but as an instrument. He felt in the transmission a crystalline core placed at the apex, a focal node of concentrated lattice that, when struck by certain sequences of vibration, released long-held information. The alien said this was technology woven from geometrics and crystalline harmonics. They called them schools, James would say later, voice slow as if tasting the echoes. They said Egypt was like a campus of learning, with each temple a different laboratory for consciousness.
Do not read those words as the narrator asserting historical fact. These are the contents of what James reported receiving. The alien framed time as elastic in the transmission and used numbers, precise sounding, almost clinical, to describe the scale of their intervention. 36,000 years ago they planted the seeds. At intervals they returned in subtle ways, adjusting, teaching, and when a civilization grew too proud or careless, they withdrew. Atlantis, in the vision, was not just an island. It was the laboratory that learned to harness power without maturity. Its collapse, the being communicated, was a cautionary tale. Technology without ethical cultivation becomes a wound. The alien did not say Atlantis like a mythmaker. It placed the fall as a procedural oversight. They had opened a field of energy that they could not fully manage when human consciousness misaligned, a cascade that scarred the Earth's systems. To prevent repetition, certain records and instruments were sealed. The Sphinx, James saw in the transmission, had been more than a guardian visage. It was an engineered sentinel, its base containing chambers where Atlantean records were stored. Crystals, etched archives, lattice works of memory designed to be unlocked only when a species' overall frequency matured enough to receive them without catastrophe. He felt the image of the Nile as a conductor. In the alien's lexicon, the river was engineered, its course adjusted as a kind of antenna, its waters infused with mineral suspensions and colloidal patterns to carry and dampen frequencies across distances, to serve as a living lattice for resonance. Again, these are not narrated as geological statements. They come as a feeling of design transmitted to him, a river retooled as part irrigation, part circuit board, part slow-moving brain.
James remembered specific sensory touches in the vision that later he would describe in the flat light of the kitchen to Margaret, like a man telling a patient about an operation he performed years ago. He saw temple chambers with walls of burnished gold and sheets of crystal, angles set to the golden ratio, a number that in the alien's telling acted less like architecture than like notation on a musical staff. He saw the grand gallery as a waveguide, the queen's chamber as a resonant node, the king's chamber as a focus for thermal and vibrational convergence. The alien provided degrees and shapes, numbers that should alarm a historian, but which James translated as the language of the vision. They said the angles were set to 51.84 degrees, he would say, his voice a confidential whisper. They said the apex crystal was centered to micromillimeters. When he related those specifics to skeptical friends, they raised logical objections. People who love anomalies also love rigor, and there were plenty of ways to invalidate the story. But James had the small common-sense habits of a clinician. He knew when a patient's recollection was shaped by leading suggestions, and when it was the quiet persistence of a memory that resisted change. This was the latter. The alien's data came with the kind of detail a surgeon remembers about a technique learned in residency, the particular shape of an instrument, the smell of saline. It came with a moral register, too. The emissary made plain that knowledge without preparation had been the root of catastrophe before. He was told, the transmission insisted, that the Anunnaki strategy now would not be brute imposition. They would not storm cities with banners. Their return, as conveyed to James, would be phased. In 2025, the world would feel small, preparatory adjustments. In March 2026, some threshold would be reached, and several sites would be activated in coordinated fashion. The ensuing years would be a long unfolding of integration and rupture. But that was not the first thing they told him. The first thing, lodged in his bone marrow like a splinter, was the image of the school, a place where discipline and sound and geometry taught humans how to hold higher frequencies. The alien transmitted also a vision of selection. It did not call it judgment. It described frequency as a gating function. Not everyone will be able to cross the threshold, the being conveyed. Some will stand before the door and feel a repellent like a physical pain. Others will pass through as through warm air. The emissary showed James a corridor of people, faces flooded with relief, others with incomprehension, some trying to force a doorway and being thrown back as if impacted by a strong field. James felt in his chest the echo of that repellent like a dull ache. The being did not enjoy this, the transmission implied. It presented the mechanism as tragic but necessary.
Because James had been a clinician in a world of life-or-death triage, the image of people being caught unprepared lodged in him like a failed operation. He imagined relatives trapped on the wrong side of a threshold. He imagined governments scrambling, issuing statements, denying, and then scrambling again as the captive footage rose. The alien's transmission included a melancholy about the moral hazard. When knowledge of such a timeline leaks, communities will either rush to build private sanctuaries or descend into exploitation. The emissary's voice, if it could be called a voice, carried the regret of someone who had seen a pattern repeat. There was a personal edge to the transmission, too. It picked at James like a scalpel. It showed him himself, not simply as an old doctor suddenly gripped by visions, but as a being with previous lives braided into his DNA, a past in which his hands had been instruments of healing. In that recalled life, he was not a surgeon skilled in the beating heart of modern medicine, but an initiatory healer who had learned to shape vibration to calm trauma. He felt the warmth of another's chest beneath his palms, heard a small bell tone in the skull that unraveled tightness as if untying a knot in cloth. The alien transmitted sequences of light, a geometry of breath and touch, and when James later tried to describe it, he could only gesture his hands and make a soft throat sound because words failed to hold the experience. Even when relaying the most intimate and miraculous-seeming parts of his vision, James remained cautious in his language with others. He never promised cures. He insisted to anyone who would listen that these were subjective revelations he had been given. "I am not prescribing," he would say, hands folded. "I am telling you what I saw." That humility, part clinical habit and part genuine awe, made his account unnerving. The man so often associated with certitude now simmered in uncertainty. The days after the backyard were a blur of calling. Reporters would later ask if he'd called them. He had not. He didn't seek fame. He found himself instead in a slow, painful rehearsal of memory, waking at 2:06 in the morning with a color on his tongue, a certain metal breath, the memory of a small crystalline instrument that fit between two fingers. He made lists. He scribbled geometric shapes on bathroom mirrors with his finger while steam fogged the glass. He would sit in the garden and hum sequences as if the body could remember intervals on its own. That is when Margaret stepped closer and spoke like the voice of someone who loves a man and knows which hospitals do not have quarters for fragmented souls. "James," she said one afternoon, laying a hand on his forearm as if she could anchor him back to the line of days. "You can't just go. There are papers, the house, your taxes." She didn't believe the backyard light, not at first. She believed in routine and in insurance forms.
But then she began to notice other things. He would pause in mid-sentence and cry. He would stare at the radio and his pupils would track things she could not see. Once she found him on the floor, knees tucked, whispering numbers like incantations. 12,800, 36,000, 51.84. She asked him to be medically reevaluated. He agreed because the part of him trained to do no harm was a stubborn moral engine. He complied with tests because compliance is its own kind of ritual. All the while the transmissions continued, gentle as tide. On the 4th week after the backyard landing, and here the narrative thins into that thin veil between evidence and faith, the alien invited him toward a memory that would be impossible to verify by any scanner. A healing he performed in another life. He saw with breathtaking clarity and a painful intimacy the body of a woman in a temple hall. Her name was not spoken in a language he could parse. It was a sign, a loop of sound felt more than heard. She had trauma lodged behind her throat, a leaden ball of fear that twisted her spine. The temple chamber smelled of oil and heated crystals. James's hands, in that life, hovered and then landed lightly on the woman's sternum. The temple resonated, not like an organ but like a living instrument, and he felt the patient's muscle loosen, heard a faint unthreading inside her like a silk thread leaving a spool. He saw the woman stand and laugh, the sound a small bell. This is the kind of vignette that can be dismissed as wishful longing, the healer who wants to remember being a healer. But the transmission's specificity was not sentimental, it was technical. He recalled certain movements that produced predictable internal responses, a slight inward pressure at the second rib changing heart rhythm, a torsion of the wrist that shifted a knot in the shoulder's fascial bands. These gestures had the air of repeated practice. He came away with a certainty that some knowledge could be carried across lifetimes, that memory could be stored, not only in stories, but somehow in more than metaphor. When he told others about that healing, and he told only a few, the kind of people who would sit through a long night and not interrupt, they asked how he could know it was not constructed from desire. James could only answer with the physical memory of the moment, the taste of heated rosemary oil on his tongue, the precise weight of the woman's hand as she gripped his sleeve afterward, the particular constellation of aches in his own shoulders that lingered as residue from that past life. "It's like a scar," he said once, "only it's in my memory." He did not rush to Egypt. The alien did not say, "Go now." It said instead that certain thresholds would align within a window. It offered dates and a cadence because, as it transmitted, the universe, at least in its scheme,
kept calendars the way humans keep appointments.
James knew the specificity of the timeline in the raw way a clinician knows the difference between a fever that is ordinary and one that is ominous. The heat is different. The breath drawn is shorter. 2025, the emissary indicated, would be a year of preparation, subtle anomalies, shifts in field detections, archaeological teams finding irregularities, governments feeling embarrassed by gaps in their narratives. March 2026, a point the being emphasized by letting the image of a temple door swing outward like a slow sun, was the first public hinge. But the alien also made emotional statements that stuck in him longer than any date. It said the knowledge was not a prize, but a burden. To be brought into presence without ethical maturation would be to invite repeat catastrophe. It spoke of choices, the chance for acceleration, and the danger of acceleration without inner work. They will not save you from your choices, the alien transmitted. They will present a mirror and tools. What you do with them is up to you. This is where James' past as a cardiologist weighed on his account and made it strangely more believable to some listeners. He began to arrange preparations with the precise care of someone who packs an emergency kit for a hurricane without panicking. He read books on acoustics, not because he believed the books would contain truth, but because he wanted to learn the language the vision had used. He meditated in a way that felt less like New Age posturing and more like a physician rehearsing a procedure. Step 1, breath. Step 2, focusing attention on the solar plexus. Step 3, letting the sound come from behind the teeth. He bought a ticket to Cairo 3 days after the backyard event. He did not tell Margaret the whole story when he purchased it. He told her he felt called to see the stones, to be present to those places. If there is something to be done, he said, I want to not be the man of the couch when it happens. She argued. They argued. He cried, and she called him absurd and loving and maddening in the same breath. Marriage as an institution survived such strains because ordinary intimacy holds extraordinary risk. If one partner begins to believe in a reality the other cannot see, they must either find new covenants or dissolve. Margaret said she would come if he insisted. He said no, because something in him felt like an emissary in training, and the alien had shown him solitary thresholds disguised as doors. Before he left, he did a mundane thing that would unsettle him for the rest of his life. He called a single trusted colleague, a man who had been confidant during long nights on call. He told him in a low, serious voice that he had been touched. The colleague responded like a clinician with equal parts curiosity and caution. Document everything, he said, but come home if you feel unsafe. James laughed then, not from mirth, but from a weight that made laughter a small release.
On the plane to Cairo, he did not sleep. The cabin lights became a field of artificial stars, each small glare a cairn of human engineering. He kept thinking of the image the alien had given him, a row of instruments inside the Great Pyramid, keyed to frequencies that could coax memory out of living tissue. He thought of the Sphinx with a sealed chest where Atlantean records slept like eggs. He thought of the Nile as a giant conductive pathway for human feeling. The imagery felt absurd when he tried to reduce it to prose. When he allowed himself to feel it, it was as vivid as a second skin. Arriving in Cairo was an anticlimax in one sense, a disorienting wash of taxi horns, dust, heat. The city was ordinary in the ways ordinary cities always are. Vendors shouted, traffic negotiated itself like a conversation, and people walked with purposes that had nothing to do with cosmic reactivations. And yet the stones were there, indifferent and unhurried. Standing near the base of the Great Pyramid, even before any official excavation or revelation, James felt a pull like gravity, but of a different order, a sense that the monument's presence was a long-held breath waiting to exhale. The rest of the narrative, the specific meetings, the Sphinx's concealed chambers, the larger public timeline, is another part of the map the alien sketched into him. For now, what James could place with an honest terror and a wonder that refused to soften was the knowledge that the emissary had given him a thing that would follow him like a shadow, the calendar of a return. It was a schedule with moral weight and a selection mechanism. It would not be neutral. It would not be a spectacle that all would greet as a holiday. It would rearrange communities, beliefs, and the stories people told about their pasts. That evening in Cairo, as the sun bled gold over the river, James sat on the balcony of a modest hotel room
and tried to capture with pen the textures of what he had been shown. He wrote clumsy diagrams. He tried to map what the alien had said about microangles and crystals. He wrote the date 2026 in bold and underlined it until the paper threatened to tear. Somewhere down below, a child laughed and an old woman bartered. The world continued, obligingly, oblivious. He began to understand his own transformation in the transaction that had occurred in his backyard, a lifetime of measured certainty being replaced by a different kind of duty. A scientist's duty had once been to diagnose and treat. Now his duty felt like bear witness. If there was a truth in the emissary's transmission at all, if 2026 held the hinge the being implied, then silence was complicity with possible catastrophe. That thought sat heavy and visceral. He did not know who to tell. He feared confession and exposure both. He feared that a premature leak could cause harm in the same way the alien had warned against, knowledge without maturity.
As the night thickened, the balcony light a dull moon beside the Nile. James tapped out one message and sent it to one email address, a brief line to a small circle of people he trusted. "I saw something," he wrote. "I think the timeline matters. If you get this, meet me. Bring skepticism. Bring open hands." He did not know then that the words he had been given would ripple outward like a pebble cast into water. He did not yet know whether they would wash the shore with new clarity or churn up sediment that would cloud everything it touched. He only knew that the alien had said, in a manner as clear as a clock striking midnight, that 2026 would not be just another year. It would be a hinge. The rest of the story, the secret chambers beneath the Sphinx, the exact mechanism of a pyramid's reactivation, the global split between those called and those repelled by the field, lay like a doorway beyond the balcony's light. James sat there long into the night, feeling the weight of the doorway and the pressure of the timeline. He thought of Margaret sleeping in their home now oceans away, of the patient charts he had once trusted to explain the world, and of the strange comfort of a voice that did not speak, but told him how to listen. He did not yet know what he would find when he pressed his ear to that door. He only knew he had to press. He folded the paper and slid it into the pocket of his shirt as if hiding a relic, as if the ink itself might attract attention. The hotel balcony cooled around him. Cairo's noises were softer at night, as if the city itself chose to listen. He had come to the stones to be present, but presence was not the same as mastery. What arrived next would teach him that mastery, if it could be called that, was less about control and more about willingness to be moved. If this account is touching something in you, curiosity, dread, or the pull toward an unanswered interior, subscribe and turn on notifications. There will be more of this timeline to follow, and James wanted to make sure that those who asked to be kept informed might still receive the reports he would send. He did not find the emissary waiting in Egypt at a dramatic hour. The transmissions continued in quieter, more fractal ways, dreams that bled into day, stray images and reflections, the sense that when he placed his palm on a stone he could feel an echo of a hand that had once guided his. In Cairo he met a few people who would become the thin, provisional scaffolding around his narrative. A young acoustician named Layla who worked in a university lab and listened to frequencies as if they were birdsong. An independent archaeologist called Omar, who had the weary, precise patience of someone who saw history as both archive and wound, and a journalist, Elena, whose skepticism was white-hot and who would later remind James that a good story needs evidence and that evidence needs proof. They gathered in the shade of a small cafe by the river.
James smelled cardamom and dust and the thin, clean smell of paperbacks. He spoke haltingly at first, the way a surgeon might explain a rare complication after the operation is over and the family demands honesty instead of comfort. He described the backyard light. He described the being. He described the phrase, 2026, and the way it had landed in him like a key in a lock. He framed everything as transmission. "This is what was put into my head," he would say, tapping his sternum as if to locate the memory's anchor. His voice had the tremor of a clinician who had watched patients choose dangerous remedies because they were promised miracles. He did not want to be that kind of person. Layla listened with a scientist's hunger, masked by a poet's face. "If the vision carries resonant detail," she said quietly, "then we can at least look at whether some elements can be modeled." Her sentence was careful. It recognized the line between what could be tested and what could not. Omar, who had spent his life negotiating permits and protective law in a country always wary of trespassers, warned immediately, "Do not go digging. Even if you think you know where a door is, the law and ethics of this land are not a narrative you can rewrite."
Elena, more blunt, asked the question the world would ask before the world knew it had to ask anything. Why you? Why now? Why tell us this at all? James fumbled for words that would not promise certainty. He told them he had no plan to brand a movement or to sell a key to salvation. He told them honestly that the fact of the transmission had changed something in him, his relationship to truth, to duty, to the possibility that there are histories stitched into us we cannot name. He asked them to be witnesses more than allies, to keep records, to be able later to say, if needed, what had been said. The night before he was to meet a small circle at the edges of the Giza Plateau, he dreamt of the Sphinx as if it were a living thing. In the dream, its eyes opened, and instead of stone, they were concentric rings of light, thin and blue and patient. From its chest, a corridor unfurled like the opening of a flower. He woke with the taste of something metallic on his tongue, and a certainty that the Sphinx in the alien's transmission was less a mythic guardian and more a vault built for times not yet understood. The detail in the dream was surgical, hinges that locked on sound, a sealing mechanism described as pressure and keywork, crystals set like teeth in a jaw. James could not verify any of it, and he would always be careful to label these elements for what they were, content of a vision. Their small group, James, Layla, Omar, Elena, proceeded as if balancing on a ridge between propriety and impending revelation. Omar obtained permissions to move near the plateau in ways that were legal and public, not clandestine. He did this because he trusted that an honest search begins by respecting the guardianship of place.
They carried notebooks and a laptop with recordings of Layla's acoustic tests, tones she played into the air near certain stones to see whether the rock would respond with subtle vibrations. Nothing dramatic happened the first days. The stones were as stones always are, patient and uninterested in human want. Still, subtle anomalies appeared and accumulated like water stains that, when traced, reveal a pattern. A local grid that had always been steady flickered at a frequency technicians could not initially explain. The satellites, Layla insisted on the word, recorded small electromagnetic disturbances that correlated in odd ways with the nights James said he thought the transmissions had been stronger. Local birds altered their migration paths in small numbers around a stretch of the Nile. None of these were a door being thrown open. They were the prelude in a score that might crescendo, or might be nothing at all. James called these the ticks of a system warming up, a phrase he used because it allowed him not to say, "I am terrified," in the flat language of a physician. In December, Layla discovered a repeated harmonic signature when she played certain ratios into a small ceramic bowl pressed against a slab at the base of an outcrop near the Giza Plateau. The sound returned as if the stone answered. It was not the kind of thing that made headlines. Scientists can be cautious with their press releases. But to James, it felt like a coup in a language he had been taught to listen to in a previous life. He recorded, he cataloged, and he wrote the numbers down on the same pad that had once held triangles and the date 2026. Then news began to leak in a way that felt both inevitable and brutal. Someone, no one ever found who, posted a blurry clip of a low, oval craft near a rural town 40 kilometers from Cairo. Government spokespeople expressed curiosity and then guarded denial. Foreign outlets sniffed at the story and labeled it hoax until their editors demanded that they at least assign reporters. The leak had the effect of turning what had been a private, odd set of phenomena into a public rumor. Social feeds distilled the story down to meme-ready phrases. Anunnaki return 2026 became a tag and then an accusation and then a prayer. James found himself unmoored by the attention he had not sought. The emissary's transmissions, perhaps aware of the widening audience as a ruler notices the spread of a stain, shifted in tone. Where before the message had been an unfolding lecture on architecture and river conductiveness, it now spoke in admonitions. When the doors opened, the pattern of impression said, "The world will not understand the library and will try to plunder it. This is not only their error, but a hazard. The instruments were never designed for greed." In January, a scientific team presented evidence at an obscure conference that certain mineral layers under the plateau displayed microstructures inconsistent with simple sedimentation.
The paper was cautious, hedged with disclaimers about sample contamination and methodological limits, but the headlines that followed in fringe circles read like the script James had carried in his pocket for months. Structures indicate intentional design.
To James, who had seen the alleged structures in his vision as lattices and microscopic crystalline nodes, the cautious language of the paper was both comfort and frustration. Proofed, perhaps, on the edges of the imagination, but still not scale enough to satisfy the hunger the emissary's voice had forced upon him. Parallel to the public moves, there were personal tests, small moments that felt more instructive than empirical. James practiced the breath sequences the transmission had given him as if they were a prescribed physical therapy. He found a rhythm where inhalation carried a faint metallic taste, and exhalation loosened a muscle in his jaw that had been clenched for 50 years. He started keeping a log, time of day, quality of the memory that surfaced, images that were less dream and more retrieval. Sometimes a face would stand clear, a hand would press across a sternum in the remembered way that had released tension in a temple. He did not perform miracles, he performed careful, gentle touches and watched for the emotional shifts that followed. It was testimony, he told himself, more than treatment. One evening, in a small room filled with books on acoustics and religion, he invited a man named Paul, a longtime friend and former colleague who had listened to James over decades, to try a simple experiment. Paul was a skeptic in the way friends are when love constrains them from mockery. He had seen James through calls and nights on duty and had always been the first to remind him of the modest limits of medicine. James explained he would not fix Paul's chronic shoulder pain, he would only try to see whether a remembered movement could change the pattern of sensation. He placed his hands carefully, not in a way that would be understood as treatment, but as a gesture, and he allowed the remembered geometry to move through him. A slight inward pressure at a point beneath the second rib, a torsion of the wrist that had, in the vision, shifted the pull in a shoulder. Paul exhaled and said slowly, after a pause where he looked at James with that look of someone who is startled by their own body, "I feel something loosen." James would tell this story later with the caution of someone who knows anecdotes cannot stand for studies. He would say, "It was not a cure, it was a moment of shift. It could be placebo, it could be the comfort of touch, but to me it read like a scar being noticed." The emissary's transmission had warned he would see both wonders and errors. James now found himself in the center of both.
People reached out to him, callers at odd hours claiming to have had similar experiences. A woman in Ohio insisting her grandmother had left a cryptic map that matched a dream James had described. A quiet group of people in India who said they had seen the same geometries in coins held at temples. The tapestry of anecdote is not proof, and James recognized this. He documented, he labeled things as vision content, and he watched patients like a physician watches recovery curves. When March of 2026 edged near, something in the public atmosphere thickened into expectation. There were organized conferences debating the ethics of opening ancient technology. Think tanks issued papers on national security ramifications, the language as dry and clinical as a surgeon's note. Speculation took many shapes: private sanctuaries, new forms of spiritual tourism, governments forming joint committees to assess and prepare. The emissary had said the Anunnaki would not storm. It had also implied that institutions would respond out of fear and bureaucratic instinct. James watched the headlines and felt sick where he had once only felt thunder in his chest. Layla's modeling work began to draw attention. She published cautious simulations, mathematical abstracts that tested how geometric structures could theoretically influence resonant fields. They did not claim ancient astronaut technology. They claimed phenomena that could be modeled under certain assumptions. Still, the models brought more eyes. Funds appeared. A private foundation offered money for further controlled research. With money came conditions: controlled access, constrained methodologies, and the ever-present fear of militarizing discovery. Omar refused certain offers, insisting the land's guardianship belonged to Egypt. His position created friction between James and him, and for the first time a rift opened in the group that had been, until then, held together by a fragile trust. As March rolled down the calendar, the emissary's transmissions increased in intensity and frequency. They were, James said, like a teacher knocking on the inside of a student's skull to make sure the student was awake. He began to report feelings that were almost physical: a heat behind the sternum like an old fever, a humming in the teeth that corresponded with notes Layla played on a tuning fork, a taste of something like warm honey and volcanic metal combined. He slept less and dreamed more. Dreams nested in dreams, building like architectural layers one could step into. Then came the night when something that could, at least in small part, be observed, occurred. It did not conform to any dramatic movie scene. There were no lights visible across the sky for miles. Instead, there were anomalies in close quarters.
On a site near the plateau, a small experimental setup Layla had built to test acoustic response recorded a sequence of harmonics that had never been produced by the program.
It was as if the stones themselves had folded the notes back with slight modulation. A nearby phone, left unwatched, displayed a series of geometric images with an intensity that caused the screen to stutter. In a village by the river, a dog that had always barked at visitors lay placid at the feet of strangers it would have once snarled at. None of these signs amounted to a door swinging free, but the accumulation of them, tacit, shareable, hauntable, felt like the air before a storm. On a morning not long after, James agreed to be filmed by Elena for a segment. She asked direct questions about the emissary's voice, about the date, 2026, about whether the transmission had ever been wrong. He answered as candidly as possible. He repeated phrases that had lodged in him. They will return to reanimate machines, not to lord over us. The selection will be by frequency. March 2026 is a hinge. He insisted on qualifiers. This is what I experienced. I do not present this as proven. I present it as testimony. Elena's segment, edited with care, did not go viral, but it did seed a different kind of public, one that paid attention. A week later, in the desert outside the zone, members of a small, authorized team approached a low structure that had been known in fragments in previous surveys. It was not listed as a tomb or a known chamber. Omar had notified the authorities, and the excavation was, by every reasonable account, legitimate. Archaeologists on site, maps produced, records logged. What the team found, what they described to James in tones that mixed wonder and fear, was a sealed niche that, when a particular frequency was played near its mouth, produced a resonance that was felt rather than heard, a pressure that made some on the team step back reflexively. A field technician dropped a screwdriver as if startled by a bell. Cameras recorded nothing visible but the crew's body language. The official statement released days later described stable ground and the absence of structural collapse. It said nothing about the sensations. James watched footage of men and women experiencing something they could not easily call by name and felt the same old double-edged blessing. Proof would breed exploitation. The emissary's melancholy about repeated human error arrived again in his mind, as if the being had tattooed a warning on his ribs. The selection mechanism, as described in the transmission, began to be observed, uneasy, partial, and contested. A small group of volunteers, vetted and briefed, were escorted to a protected chamber by the official team. Some who approached the threshold reported a repellent sensation, nausea, vertigo, a dull pressure that affected breathing. Others walked in as if through warm air, reporting a sensation of rightness and weeping for reasons they could not articulate.
It was not universal, and the scientists insisted on caution. No experiment could be run until proper protocols were designed. But the pattern matched what James had been told years earlier in a lawn under a pale oval of light. One volunteer, a woman whose profession was as public defender, stepped back from a threshold and said, her voice shaking, "It feels like it's saying, 'I am not ready.'" To James, the remark sounded like the deliberate phrase of a being that knew how to call something into check. The fact that the chamber's gate did not open for some reinforced the emissary's claim. It was not an arbitrary selection, but a resonance-based gate. Whether that resonance measured spiritual maturity, measured biochemical markers, or measured something else entirely remained an open theological and scientific question, one James guarded with the insistence that all relevant parties should avoid mistaking correlation for causation. The global reaction started to bifurcate, as the emissary had predicted. For some, the events were a spiritual renaissance, proof that an older lineage of knowledge had returned to offer tools for wellness and understanding. For others, the demonstrations were dangerous. The very idea of opening unknown mechanisms seemed to many like inviting contagion. Conspiracy flourished wildly. The emissary, speaking in the hush of James's chest, warned of opportunists who would use the timeline to build private sanctuaries or exploit those seeking readiness. He had told James, in what felt like a parenthetical of sorrow, that knowledge without the scaffolding of ethics is like a fire in a dry house. It will burn what it touches and leave ash. Through all this, the personal stakes tightened. Margaret, who had elected not to come with him to Egypt because of family ties and fear, called him more often than before. She listened to his updates and read articles he did not ask to be read. She pressed him for decisions. There were practicalities he could not ignore: the house, their finances, the way her life had interlaced with his for decades. He called her from a long sand-swept plain and told her, honestly, that he did not know whether his going to the plateau would change the world or only him. The distance this created was not the rupture of betrayal so much as the slow wear of different realities separating on a map. On a late afternoon in March, with a wind that smelled like distant rain and hot stone, a coordinated event approached its scheduled hinge. The official calendar was careful.
The ministry had released statements that something of interest was being monitored. International delegations were present. Journalists and scientists crowded, each swept by a different type of desire. The emissary's transmission, James insisted again and again, had said March 2026 would be a hinge, not necessarily a grand opening. A hinge can open a door a little and then swing closed. It can creak and warn and not yield.
Even the language used by officials, monitoring, research phase, no imminent threat, was a hinge of bureaucratic tenor. The night before the scheduled public demonstration, James sat alone on a low ridge and let the desert breathe over him. He felt the memory of the healer's hands, ancient and known, and he felt, with an almost comic modernity, the weight of cameras, microphones, and the possibility of being studied. He had told himself the mission at this point was witness and stewardship, not fame. He had also been warned by the emissary that being a witness welcomed attention, and attention invites risk. The following day, the demonstration unfolded as a collapse of genres, part scientific briefing, part religious gathering, part security exercise. Layla presented acoustic graphs. Omar spoke about preservation. Officials reiterated custody and law. Then the instruments were set, an arrangement of tuning devices of Layla's design, sensors run by teams in neutral suits. The world's cameras trained on a stone mouth that had been called by locals a shallow seam. Volunteers came forward under controlled conditions. When one volunteer stepped toward the mouth, cameras were ready. The sound technicians recorded. At a certain pitch, a harmonic Layla had modeled but never coaxed from the machine. The volunteer's face contorted as if touched by a sudden cold. He stepped backward, sputtering. The cameras picked up the body language and the ripple of voices. The footage would later be replayed and annotated with many theories. Another volunteer, a woman with silver hair, walked forward and paused. She closed her eyes and then, in front of the world, began to cry quietly. The field technicians could not capture a visual change in the stone, but they recorded micropressure and a shift in the electromagnetic field. It was as if the place was sending a message that only certain people could receive. James stood at the periphery, his hands in his pockets. The emissary's earlier transmitted line, "Selection will be frequency, not paperwork," unfolded before him in live motion. He felt grateful that the protocol existed. He also felt dread for those who would be excluded. The ancient melancholy the emissary had expressed about responsibility and the terror of unprepared technological release felt in that moment like a prophecy made flesh. In the chaos that followed, when pundits and clerics and politicians all tried to make the event mean what they wanted it to mean, James found a different rhythm. He was pulled to the side by a woman he had not met before, an archaeologist working with a small spiritual community in Luxor. She was in tears. She pressed a folded piece of fabric into his hand. Inside was a small carved disc, the surface etched with symbols he recognized from his visions. Concentric rings, a small central node. "My grandmother found it buried near where we pray," she said, voice trembling.
She said to give it to the man who saw the light. He did not know whether the disc had any power he could name. He tucked it into his shirt as if carrying a benediction. The world's reaction accelerated. Markets shuddered, not from fear of financial apocalypse, so much as from the peculiar anxiety of institutions confronted with unknown variables. Some governments convened emergency committees. Some militant groups mobilized rhetoric. Religious leaders convened councils and issued sharp warnings about idolatry and false prophets. Conspiracy forums lit up with claims and counterclaims. Every assertion that matched the emissary's content, dates, the idea of the schools, Sphinx chambers, became either proof of a leak or proof of a global hoax. James felt the pressure of narratives collapsing into their simpler forms, myth and panic. Amid the noise, the emissary's transmissions became more personal and more tender. In a night where the stars were dull and the desert seemed to sleep as if exhausted, James received an image that he would never forget. It was a circle of figures in a temple hall, hands laid upon stones, faces turned inward. The being transmitted a cadence of thought, not a command but an invitation. Work on yourselves. The tools are not a replacement for inner cultivation. Come with steadiness. The vision was not directive in the sense of a manual. It was ethical in the way a teacher's admonition can be ethical. Do not make this a plunder. James responded to that instruction with what he could muster, a return to small practices, to breath, to listening. He meditated longer. He resumed simple acts he could attest to, sleep patterns, journaling, presence with Margaret on phone calls where they read old letters. He sought to anchor his life in human tasks, fixing a leaky tap, remembering to call a neighbor about groceries. This was not an escape from the larger drama, but a recognition that ground holds in storms. The emissary, in one of its clearest transmissions that James could recall,
articulated the reasoning behind the Anunnaki's return in dangerously precise imagery. It transmitted the metaphor of a hospital wing, ancient teachers as doctors who had built instruments when a species' collective health reached an inflection point. They had left the machines set to wait until a threshold of readiness and consent aligned. They would return to reanimate, not to supplant agency, but to offer tools. The alien insisted, through patterns that James nonetheless rendered into the English he could speak, that the difficulty lay in the human response. Offering tools where there is greed, the pattern suggested, is negligent. We choose caution. This caveat carried a haunting implication that would not leave him. The Anunnaki had apparently learned their own lesson from Atlantis.
The emissary's image of Atlantis had been clinical, framed as cause and effect. A civilization mastered power before maturing its ethics, and the result was catastrophe. The Anunnaki, in response, had sealed certain instruments, woven them into structures and tides, and waited for a maturity that could be measured not simply by technology, but by frequency, that ambiguous measure the transmissions insisted on. Whether frequency meant moral development, energetic signature, or a biochemical correlate, James would not define, and insisted that others should not mistake his articulations for hard conclusions, was unknown. As the months unfolded toward the summer, the world settled into a new rhythm of attention and denial. The 2026 hinge had, as predicted by the emissary, and as James had feared, split communities. Some camps prepared in earnest. Retreats popped up promising frequency training. Private sanctuaries advertised readiness programs. Specialists in sound therapy reported a surge in inquiries. James watched these developments with frank alarm. He could recognize the earnest seekers from the opportunists by a certain lightness in the eyes, a wistful honesty that simply reached for truth, versus the fevered glint of those selling an answer for a price. Others, a vast number, continued their lives with a different kind of fitness, caution tempered with distance. Shops remained open, children went to school, and the ordinary rhythms of life upheld themselves like a dam. But even in ordinariness, the question embedded itself. If the emissary's date was right, if March 2026 opened anything at all, what part would they play? Would they be called? The haunting power of the question spread quietly, its echo lodged in bedrooms and boardrooms alike. James's decision took shape in a mundane place, a kitchen table strewn with bills, a chipped mug, a note from Margaret that read, "Be safe," in her angular hand. He could have retreated into domesticity and let the events proceed without him. He could have allowed the world to meet whatever it might meet without his witness. He found himself doing neither. He chose, quietly and without fanfare, to travel to the plateau when the next authorized window opened. He did it because he believed being present mattered, and because the emissary's transmissions had meant witness itself an ethical act. The day he arrived there again, the heat was a presence like a second skin. The plateau's stones stood with the same indifferent patience. Scientists worked with the solemnity of professionals who understand the difference between curiosity and stewardship. James was conscious that his presence was both personal pilgrimage and a public event. Cameras filmed his approach, but he kept his attention bent to small things. A bird's flight, a child's laughter in the distance, the way a student's hand trembled when she touched a sample. What he hoped for, strangely, was not a revelation in the cinematic sense. He hoped for steadiness.
He hoped the people there would not collapse into superstition or violence. He hoped that the emissary's melancholy would not be vindicated by human greed. He hoped, at a human level, that Margaret would be okay with the choices he had made. Late that afternoon, a minor event occurred that would be amplified into myth by many. A team ran a controlled activation trial in a sealed chamber under strict archaeological oversight. The chamber pulsed with a sequence of hums. Volunteers came forward under watchful eyes. The sensor arrays registered a wave pattern consistent with what Layla's models predicted could be a modulation of resonance. Some volunteers reported sensations that matched the earlier accounts: pressure, warmth, relief. One volunteer reported an intense repellent force and had to be helped back. The team paused the test. The footage circulated, then was debated ad infinitum. To James, it was neither proof nor disproof. It was an ethical mirror and a test. That night, when the sky over Giza shone with a clarity unusual for a city, James sat alone on the edge of the plateau and let the silence speak. He thought of the emissary's first transmission, of the backyard light and the words that had lodged in him like a promise: "We will return to reanimate the machines." He thought of his own past hands, both the surgeons and the temple healers, and of the responsibility carried in each.
He thought of the selection mechanism and its inevitable moral toll, families separated by thresholds, communities divided by readiness. He thought of Margaret and of all the small mercies of ordinary life he might be leaving behind. He remembered one fragment the emissary had transmitted that he had not yet shared publicly, a line not about dates or tools, but about intention. The being had transmitted an image of an amphitheater where humans gathered to learn, not to be bestowed with miracles, but to be taught how to hold them responsibly. "We will offer instruments," the image said in its way. "We will show doors. The rest is your work." That sentence haunted him more than the provision of dates. Offering tools implies a moral contract, and moral contracts presume agency. The Anunnaki's return, as the emissary framed it, presented humanity with both a possibility of elevation and an ethical test. The haunting, the title promises, is not merely the fear of contact, but the knowledge that contact would force people to answer an ancient question. What will you do when you are given power you do not yet understand? In the days and weeks that followed, James shifted from being a man who only observed to a witness who also spoke. He wrote long letters to a small circle of trusted colleagues and to Margaret, in which he explained his perception and his limits. He insisted he was not offering a method, not writing a manual, and not selling a salvation.
He insisted that if there was any plan to prepare, it should be rooted in ethics, communal care, respect for ancient sites, legal stewardship, a refusal to privatize knowledge for profit. These simple moral stances cost him friends and earned him others. They kept him awake in the night, but also grounded him with a clarity that felt like new bone. As the year advanced, anomalies continued in fits and starts. Small chambers displayed resonant properties. Sound patterns emerged in the data. Volunteers reported being repelled or embraced. Governments convened new task forces. The narrative fractured into 1,000 shards, each reflecting the original message differently. The emissary's line about the 7-year transition, 2026 to 2033, hung over public discourse as if it were a deadline. People debated whether those years would be a renaissance or a drawn-out contest between forces of integration and reaction. James, in interviews and private talks, repeated one last image the emissary had given him, a clarifying metaphor that he used in place of specifics, because metaphor can hold nuance better than declarative sentences. The emissary had transmitted an image of a schoolroom and a scalpel, knowledge paired with responsibility. "They will not bring salvation on a silver platter," he would say. "They will bring instruments. The test is whether we learn to wield them with wisdom." In the end, his personal transformation, perhaps the smallest miracle of all, was not the public drama, but the private recalibration. A once rational cardiologist who had spent his life measuring pulses and explaining anomalies now kept space for the impossible without abandoning skepticism. He returned home for a time and found the ordinary things that hold life together: Margaret's hands, the neighbor's dog, the precise friction of his keys in his pocket. He continued to write, to document, to warn, and to invite. He learned to say the difference between "this is what I experienced" and "this is truth." He never proclaimed certainty. He offered testimony. The world, meanwhile, continued towards March 2026 with all its human mess. Committees formed and dissolved. Opportunists rose while some true seekers trained in quiet ways. Governments drafted emergency protocols while local communities organized mutual aid. The emissary's time frame remained both prophecy and invitation, open to interpretation and to misuse. Months later, when a small, controlled activation occurred under international supervision, the footage circulated and the debates roared again. Some called it proof, others called it danger. For James, who watched the footage in a hotel room with Margaret on the phone, the primary sensation was grief at the knowledge that not everyone would be ready. The emissary had not offered a comfortable ending. It had transmitted what it saw as a schedule and a mechanism, and then stepped back into the shadow of contingency.
That ambiguity is perhaps the most haunting aspect of all. So what did the aliens say about the Anunnaki return in 2026? It gave James a calendar and an ethic, a timeline that marked a hinge, a mechanism that favored resonance over papers, a machine-like architecture in stone and river that could be reanimated, and a sorrowful teaching about responsibility anchored in the memory of a fallen Atlantis. It gave him images, pyramids as instruments, a sphinx guarding archives, the Nile as a living conductor. It offered a vision of selection. Some would pass, some would be repelled, and it warned that knowledge without wisdom kills. Those transmissions have haunted him since that night in the backyard, and they will haunt anyone who contemplates what it means to be offered extraordinary instruments without the practice of restraint. If you find yourself asking whether you are called, know this: the call is as much about inner work as it is about external doors. The emissary's message, as James received and described it, placed the moral weight on human shoulders, not on distant gods. The anomaly in the story is not merely contact, it is the mirror offered to a species. How one answers that mirror will determine whether the instruments are stewardship or catastrophe. If you want to go deeper, if you want to see James' personal notes, annotated timelines, and the careful distinctions he made between vision and verifiable claim, there is an optional resource that compiles his writings and relevant public reports. It is not a manual of preparation, and it does not promise results. Think of it as a map to the conversations that might help you think through what being called could mean. Optional resource, outcomes vary, nothing there guarantees readiness or any specific outcome. One last practical word, because the emissary's transmission and James's journey both insisted on it. Archaeological sites are protected for good reasons. Do not attempt to excavate, to trespass, or to interfere with heritage. Respect the law, respect the land, and respect the people who steward these places. The return hinted at in the backyard that night is, according to the transmission James received, not a single event, but an unfolding. The machines may awaken. The Sphinx may be read in new ways. The Nile's subtle textures may matter in this strange calculus of memory. But the haunting truth, the one that sits heavier than any date or device, is that whoever holds the knowledge must first hold wisdom. The rest is choice. Are you called? If the question lingers in you, if the thought wakes you at 3:13 in the morning and tastes like river fog in your mouth, then the answer the emissary gave James will not let you sleep either. What you do with that sleeplessness, whether you harden it into fear or let it shape a life of careful, ethical preparation, may be the only measure that matters when the doors, if they open, ask to be met.